Film has the unique capability to manipulate our perception of time. It is commonly used to slow time down, but it can also speed time up. When minutes, hours, or even years seem to fly by in the blink of an eye, this is referred to as a time lapse. How can filmmakers create this effect? And how do they use this distinctive tool without taking an audience out of a story? This is the ultimate guide to time lapse. Before we speed ahead, be sure to subscribe to Studio Binder and click the bell to stay up to date on all our videos. Now, let's jump forward. A time lapse refers to a series of frames taken over time that, when played back, appear to speed up time. This means that time lapses are captured at a rate that is slower than the rate at which it will be played back. For example, if your project is playing at 24 frames per second, a time lapse is any shot with a frame rate that is under 24 FPS. Most people associate time lapses with depictions of slow-moving changes that are drastically sped up. But a time lapse technically refers to any kind of playback that speeds up the real-life duration. The technique is as old as filmmaking itself. In the 1890s, the French scientist Georges Demeny used what he called a photographic revolver to take multiple exposures over regular intervals. Soon after, Georges Méliès helped bring the technique to filmmaking with Carrefour de l'Opéra, which has since been lost. And by 1910, naturalist F. Percy Smith pioneered a now common use for the time lapse, applying it to nature photography in The Birth of a Flower. Today, most continue to associate time lapse with nature documentaries, as it can quickly demonstrate evolution in the natural world. But time lapse can also be found in narrative film and TV. Before one can consider its creative uses, it is important to understand how a time lapse is achieved. Creating a time lapse is relatively simple. Today, many cameras have a time lapse setting where you can adjust how frequently you want a frame captured. The longer the interval, the faster the time lapse will move. For example, if your playback is set at 24 frames per second, shooting at 12 frames per second will play back twice as fast as normal, whereas shooting at 1 frame per second will play back 24 times as fast. A camera will typically be placed on a tripod or another device which has precise control over movement. This is because any extraneous movement between frames will create a jittery and difficult to comprehend sequence. When the necessary frames have been captured, they can be placed in order on an editing timeline. An editor can then lay out the images to create a consistent frame rate with the rest of the project. For example, if the project is at 24 FPS, the editor will want to include 24 images per second. Alternatively, if they have too few frames or want the audience to sit with the individual frames for longer, they can hold on each for a larger duration. Having a camera is the most necessary component of a time lapse, but a filmmaker should also consider other equipment. If the goal of a time-lapse sequence is a static shot, then all that is required is a tripod and a camera. The type of camera required for a time-lapse depends on the type of time-lapse. An Alexa, for example, can be used to shoot a time-lapse at 1 frame per second. But for longer intervals, most cinematographers will opt for a stills camera that have time-lapse settings. Tracking, craning, tilting, and panning are also possible with the right equipment. Time lapses that involve camera movement are often referred to as hyperlapses. Motorized systems like the Kessler second shooter can be programmed to move at a specific rate over a predetermined length of time. These devices are often on tracks, but the head is also motorized, allowing for tilts and pans. Drones like the DJI Mini 4 Pro can also be programmed to capture a time-lapse with movement. A time-lapse can be used in a variety of ways. Let's look at some creative applications. By its very nature, a time-lapse shows the passage of time. And movies and TV shows use this to different ends. In El Camino, time-lapses are used as transitions, showing the time of day evolve. Furiosa pushes this approach even further, showing years pass. The wig being mangled by the growing plant emphasizes Furiosa's evolution in the time that passes. The high-speed nature of a time-lapse can be used for thematic purposes. Filmmakers will often use the technique over cityscapes to emphasize a fast-paced urban lifestyle, or direct it at the stars to show the spinning vastness of space. In A Ghost Story, David Lowery used time-lapses to feed into the core theme of his film.
Dealing with the passage of time and reconciling oneself to the inevitability of that. And that's a very simple and very universal concept, but one that is still so complex and troublesome, and you can wrap up every emotion in that.
In adaptation, the technique is used to illustrate that flowers will continue to flourish regardless of the human stories around them. Variations on a time-lapse can be used to serve the purpose of a narrative. In Lucy, a CGI version of time-lapse is used to show her command over time. Francis Ford Coppola uses a similar technique to create surreal, dreamlike imagery in Megalopolis. The opening credits of Glitch reverses a time-lapse of a wilting flower, communicating the central concept of the show. People are resurrected from death in perfect health. Just like with any other shot, camera movement can also be used creatively when planning out a time-lapse. It can create the feeling of chaos, as it does in Requiem for a Dream. Or it can make a forest feel endless, as it does in BBC's Plants. While the time-lapse is a very specific technique, there's no one way to use it. It's a powerful tool, calling attention to one force no one can fight: the passage of time. Don't let more time pass before you start your next project. And when you do, be sure to use Studio Binder software, which gives you all the tools you need, from screenwriting to shot listing to storyboarding. We'll see you next week, or in time-lapse terms, we'll see you in a few minutes.